I could see it on Ryan's face before he ever said a word. That particular kind of certainty men get when they believe they've already won something. We were sitting in one of the city's most expensive restaurants, candlelight catching the diamond studs in my ears, and he was smiling at me the way you smile at a puzzle you're confident you've already solved. A beautiful blonde. Wealthy. Quiet. Trusting. That's what he saw across that table. He had no idea I already knew exactly who he was. And he had absolutely no idea that this dinner, of all our dinners, was the one where I would finally begin the process of ending him. My name is Jessica Carter. I'm 30 years old, and I've spent most of my adult life being underestimated in exactly the way people underestimate a certain kind of woman: blonde hair that always looks effortlessly done even when it isn't, blue eyes that give away very little. A wardrobe so consistently polished that colleagues used to joke I must sleep in it. I rarely raise my voice. I rarely show much of anything on my face at all, which people tend to read as emptiness, when in fact it's the opposite. I've spent my entire life reading rooms, reading people, noticing the small inconsistencies between what someone says and what their eyes do while they say it. It's the one advantage nobody ever sees coming, precisely because nobody bothers looking for it in a woman who looks the way I look. Ryan Brooks was 38, charming in that specific, practiced way that makes people trust him within minutes of meeting him. He had a talent for remembering small details about people: a sister's name, a childhood dog, an inside joke from someone's college years, and repeating them back at exactly the right moment, so you walked away feeling deeply, unusually understood. I would learn eventually that it wasn't empathy at all. It was technique, refined over more than a decade of doing precisely what he was doing to me, identifying wealthy, guarded women and slowly, patiently making himself indispensable to their lives. He believed, down to his bones, that beautiful women were rarely sharp, that the prettier the face, the softer the mind behind it, and that softness was the only quality that ever really mattered to him. It was a belief that had clearly served him well for years. It was also the exact belief that was about to destroy him, because I built my entire plan around it. I'd known who Ryan really was for almost 3 weeks before that first dinner ever happened. A colleague at the family office that manages part of my trust mentioned, in passing, a name that sounded familiar from a quiet warning circulated years earlier among a small network of wealthy families: women who compared notes, discreetly, about men who moved through their social circles a little too smoothly, courted a little too quickly, and disappeared eventually with settlements, jewelry, or entire sections of a divorce paid out before anyone fully understood what had happened. Ryan had 2 previous marriages behind him, both ending in confidential settlements, both former wives now living quietly, saying very little to anyone who asked. I hired a private investigator the same week I heard his name mentioned at a charity gala, 3 days before he accidentally struck up a conversation with me by the dessert table, a meeting he believed, for months afterward, had been entirely his own idea. I let him believe it. That was, in many ways, my entire strategy. I've learned that the fastest way to understand exactly what a person wants is to give them just enough rope to reveal it themselves, slowly, in their own words, at their own pace. So I let Ryan court me. I let him bring flowers to my office, hand-picked, he always claimed, from a small florist he'd discovered that happened to specialize in my favorite variety of peony, a detail I'd mentioned exactly once, in passing, at a dinner party he'd apparently taken careful mental notes at. I let him take me to restaurants he clearly couldn't quite afford on his stated income, watched him slide his card across the table with the same practiced ease every time, and let him talk, at length, about his consulting business. A business my investigator had already confirmed generated almost no verifiable income at all. Our relationship from the outside looked like something out of a magazine. Friends called us the perfect couple. My assistant gushed about the flowers that arrived at the office every other week. Even my own mother, usually the most skeptical person in any room, remarked more than once how attentive Ryan seemed, How thoughtful. How different from the string of forgettable men I'd dated in my 20s. I smiled through all of it, said the right things at the right moments, and kept building, quietly, methodically, a file that grew thicker with every month that passed. I watched him work a room at my family's charity events with the same practiced ease every time, complimenting the right people, remembering the right names, always positioning himself just close enough to me to be photographed together, but never so close it looked desperate. I noticed how carefully he timed his affection, never too much in public, always exactly enough to be remembered as thoughtful rather than performative. Most women would have simply enjoyed being courted that attentively. I catalogued it instead, the way I catalog almost everything, filing away each small, deliberate gesture as one more piece of evidence confirming what I already suspected. 4 months in, Ryan proposed. He did it beautifully, predictably, on a rooftop at sunset with a string quartet he'd hired and a ring that cost more than most people's annual salary financed, my investigator later confirmed, through a credit line he'd opened using a false projection of expected consulting revenue. I said yes. Watching his face in that moment, genuine excitement flickering behind his practiced expression, I understood something with total clarity. He wasn't performing happiness because he loved me. He was performing happiness because, in his mind, the hardest part was finally almost over. 3 weeks before the wedding, my family attorney arrived with the prenuptial agreement, a document nearly 90 pages long, dense with the kind of language most people's eyes glaze over within the first paragraph. Ryan barely read it. He skimmed the first few pages, nodded along as the attorney summarized the broad strokes in a calm, unhurried voice, and signed exactly where indicated, smiling the entire time. In his mind, I'm certain, prenuptial agreements were formalities, obstacles that mattered right up until the marriage was legally finalized and a lifetime of slow, patient erosion could begin. Once we're married, he must have told himself, watching his own signature settle onto the page, everything changes. He had no idea how literally, and how catastrophically, that thought would come true, just not in the direction he expected. What Ryan never bothered to fully understand, buried in the dense legal language he'd skimmed past on his way to the signature line, was the actual structure of my wealth. The public version of my life, the mansion, the cars, the appearance of easy, inherited abundance is real, but almost none of it is technically mine to simply hand over. Nearly everything of substance sits inside a family trust established 2 generations ago, managed by a board of trustees who answer to nobody's charm, structured specifically to protect the family's assets from exactly the kind of situation Ryan believed he was walking into. My personal accounts, the ones actually accessible to a spouse in any conventional sense, hold a comparatively modest sum, carefully separated from the trust by design. I grew up watching two aunts go through devastating divorces before this structure ever existed. I had no intention of repeating their history. Buried deeper still in that 90-page document was a single clause I'd requested specifically, after my investigators' findings came back, that Ryan had glossed over entirely in his rush to reach the signature page. It stated, in careful legal language, that should either party be found to have entered the marriage under materially false pretenses including, but not limited to, concealed relationships with other partners, or marriage substantially motivated by financial gain rather than genuine partnership, that party would automatically forfeit any financial claim against the marriage's assets, and would additionally be liable for the other party's legal costs and a predetermined compensation sum. Ryan signed it without a second thought, confident, as always, that no one would ever bother checking closely enough to enforce it. Our wedding was elegant, exactly the kind of event Ryan had always imagined, standing at the center of 300 guests, a string quartet, champagne that cost more per bottle than his monthly rent before I'd quietly started covering it. He spent the reception working the room with practiced ease, already, I'm sure, mentally rehearsing which accounts he'd start asking about once the honeymoon ended and the "we're a team now" conversations could plausibly begin. Those conversations never went the way he'd planned. Within the first few weeks of marriage, Ryan discovered, slowly and with growing frustration, that my actual liquidity was a fraction of what he'd assumed. My personal accounts covered a comfortable, elegant life, but nowhere near the scale he'd been counting on, when he pushed, gently at first and then with increasing impatience, for access to the family money. I simply smiled and explained, calmly, that the trust operated independently of either of us, exactly as it always had, exactly as my attorney had explained in the meeting he'd barely paid attention to. It was around this time that my investigator delivered the final piece of the file I'd been quietly assembling for nearly a year. A woman named Vanessa, 26 years old, had been receiving regular payments from Ryan's consulting account for the past 8 months, payments that continued, uninterrupted, straight through the engagement, the wedding planning, and the ceremony itself. Photographs showed the two of them meeting regularly at a hotel bar downtown, the kind of casual familiarity between two people that no amount of careful explanation could later reframe as innocent. Text messages, obtained through channels my attorney assured me were entirely legal, confirmed exactly what the photographs suggested. I didn't confront him immediately. I waited 3 more weeks, calm and unreadable as always, gathering the final details, before finally inviting him to what he believed was a quiet dinner at home to discuss next steps for merging our finances properly. He arrived in good spirits already, I could tell, mentally rehearsing the conversation he'd been waiting months to have. Instead, I set a thick folder on the table between us. "Before we talk about finances," I said, my voice as calm and even as it had been on our very first dinner together, "I'd like to show you something." Inside the folder were the photographs. The bank transfers, itemized and dated, showing exactly how much of his so-called consulting income had actually been payments to Vanessa, disguised through a shell arrangement he'd apparently assumed no one would ever bother tracing. Printed excerpts of the text messages. And finally, a formal report from the private investigator I'd hired the week before our very first date, documenting his 2 previous marriages, both ended under remarkably similar circumstances, both former wives willing, once contacted, to confirm the pattern in careful, measured detail. Ryan sat in silence for a long moment, his practiced charm draining visibly from his face as he understood, piece by piece, exactly how thoroughly I had read him from the very beginning. "You knew," he finally said. "This whole time. You knew, and you married me anyway." "I married you," I said, "because I needed you to sign a document you clearly never intended to honor. Now I have everything I need to make sure you honor it anyway." He tried, for a while, to talk his way out of it, the same practiced charm that had worked on countless other women flickering weakly back into his voice. He called it a misunderstanding. He called Vanessa just a friend going through a hard time. He suggested, at one point, that I had set him up from the very beginning, as though the crime here belonged to the woman who had simply paid attention, rather than the man who had spent 8 months funneling money to another woman while planning a wedding. I let him talk. I always let people talk themselves fully into a corner before I say another word, and this time was no different. When he finally ran out of explanations, I simply slid the folder an inch closer to him across the table and waited. I explained, with the same unhurried calm I'd maintained through the entire relationship, exactly what the prenuptial agreement's clause meant for him now. Documented infidelity, confirmed prior to and continuing through the marriage. A financial arrangement with another woman, funded during our engagement. A pattern, corroborated by 2 previous spouses, of entering marriages for financial gain rather than genuine partnership. Under the terms he had signed without reading, Ryan wasn't simply walking away with nothing. He was legally obligated to cover my attorney fees, the investigator's costs, and a predetermined compensation figure that, once finalized in court months later, left him considerably poorer than he'd been the day he first spotted me across a charity gala dessert table. The divorce proceedings became, briefly, the kind of story whispered about at every social event Ryan had once used to identify his next target. Word travels quickly in circles built on reputation and trust, and within months, the same charm that had once opened doors for him began, instead, to close them. The women he might once have approached had, by then, heard his name mentioned in exactly the kind of quiet network conversation that had first alerted me to who he really was. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. On the day the settlement was finalized, I walked out of the courthouse in the same composed, unhurried way I walk through everything, declined the reporter who'd somehow caught wind of the case and tried to ask me for a comment, and got into my car without once looking back toward the man standing on the courthouse steps behind me. Somewhere behind me, I imagine, he was already rehearsing a new version of his own story, a kinder one, probably, one where he was simply unlucky, simply misunderstood, rather than a man who had spent over a decade counting on exactly the kind of woman he'd finally, fatally, misjudged. He believed beauty meant weakness. He believed a quiet, agreeable woman with an easy smile was, by definition, an easy woman to fool. In the end, his biggest mistake wasn't underestimating me specifically. It was believing, the way he'd believed it his entire adult life, that intelligence always announces itself loudly, that it always looks the way people expect it to look. It never once occurred to him that the sharpest person in the room might be the one saying the least, watching everything, and waiting, patiently, for exactly the right moment to close the folder she'd already finished writing long before he ever pulled out her chair. Would you have trusted him?